Hello, and welcome back to a third session of my React Hooks course. Today I'm going to cover style components, which is honestly one of the best things I've used for web development. So to install it, we're going to go to installation and you can copy this command right here. Now, before we get started, I just want to explain a little bit why we're using it. So let's go to hero section. And here you can see we have an image, h1 and p, and none of these HTML tags have any styling so far. And if we want to style the title or the description, then we would have to use either inline styling, which gets very ugly when you have a lot of properties, or you would have to create a new CSS file. So if you look at layout, for example, layout has to import layout.css in order to apply any of the styling for that specific component. But in this case, we simply set the global styling. Now, going back to hero section, you can imagine that because we're going to have hundreds of components in the future, having a CSS file for every single component is going to be a mess. On top of that, you would have to write the class name and then match between the CSS file and the component file. CSS class names are global, and because they're global, they have to be unique enough so that they don't conflict with each other. So with style components, we're solving that and a lot more. For example, we have the power of Sass, which I'm going to get into very quickly. And then you have the power of inline styling with JavaScript, which means that you can pass the props to your style component and do really interesting scripting to make your CSS so much more powerful. Now, to install style components, here we have the terminal, and to open it is Command J. And so the first node is to start or stop our server. You can create a new one, so click on the plus sign, and here you can install new libraries. So I'm just going to copy and paste this command right here, enter. And this is going to install style components. This is also how you install any new library in the future. So now we have two space for our terminal. And once you're done with installing this new library, you can delete this space by clicking on the trash. And now we're back to just a single space where we have the local environment set up using Gatsby develop. Now, as a side note, you can stop or restart your server by doing Control-C. So this is going to stop your server. And also when you close your VS Code, you will be stopping your server as well. So when you come back, you're going to open the terminal again, and then you're going to do Gatsby develop to restart your server. Also, sometimes some libraries require a restart for your server. So this is how you would do it. Now I'm just going to close the terminal and then I'm going to go back to my main site. If I refresh this, I can see that it still works. So my local environment works fine. Another side note about Prettier, where we had a little problem earlier to apply it. Well, you can do Shift Command and P to open user settings again, and we're going to find format. And here, for the default formatter, make sure to have esbemp.prettier-VS Code selected. And so if you have this, then your code formatter should be working fine. And if you want to test it, you can just remove some indentation here and you save. Prettier is going to automatically format that indentation. So now your code is always consistent with mine. Okay, now let me just make this a little bit bigger, and we are going to import style components. So to do that, we're going to go to the third line and we're going to import styled from quotes style components. So let's talk about the section structure. And this is what I use for every single section of a page. And it's very consistent. It covers most scenarios that I need for my UI. So starting with the wrapper, where it's taking the full width of the screen and it's responsible for the background. You can also have floating background in the future. And then we have the content wrapper, which is responsible for the content area. And typically you want to limit this content area to about, let's say for the iPad, so roughly at 980. And so for this wrapper, it's going to be centered within the screen, and you're going to have some padding to the left and the right so that on smaller screens, you always have proper padding. Then for each section, we're going to have margins. And the special thing about margins is that they don't add to each other. So if you have another section next to this one, and you have a 200 margin here, and the other one has a 200 margin, it's going to remain 200 between the two sections. And this is different from padding, where if you put a padding 200 here and the other one has 200 padding, then it's going to be a total of 400. So the margin has that extra advantage. And later on, we're going to learn about media queries, where we can set this to a single column versus 2 columns for bigger screens. Now back to our code, we're going to set exactly that structure for our component. So first of all, we're going to start with the wrapper. So between these pointy brackets, we're going to set wrapper with a capital W, and always close your tags. So wrapper at the end as well, right after the /. And then we're going to create the content wrapper. So open bracket, content wrapper, close bracket, and this is going to automatically create the end one. So we can just move this one right after link. And if you save, it's going to automatically indent here. But here's the thing, we haven't declared these style components yet. And even though we imported style components, we haven't used it, which is why it's grayed out. So now we're going to use style component. So we're going to go at the very end, and we're going to type const wrapper is equal to styled, which is what we imported from style component, dot, and this is where we choose what kind of HTML tag that we want. In this case, we're going to use div, and now we're going to apply the CSS styles. But in order to use the CSS properties in our JavaScript file, we have to use the backticks like these. And you always have to have the opening one and the closing one. Just like the curly braces and the parentheses have to have the opening one and the closing one, the same for the curly braces. So the backtick, and then inside the space, we can set our CSS properties. So going back to the Figma, one of the advantages is to use complex CSS code such as the background gradient. And so we're just going to copy this gradient property for the background, and then back to our wrapper inside the backticks, we're going to paste that CSS property. Now we still have to declare the content wrapper, so let's do that quickly. Const content wrapper is equal to style.div backticks. And so content wrapper is also a div. So you can save this, and now we have our site working again, but now with a gradient as a background. So going to the content wrapper, we're going to set a max width. So max width to 1234 pixels. So 1234 pixels. The reason why I'm using max width and not width is that width is fixed, meaning that it's always going to have this width that I'm going to set. So for example, if I set it without the max width, you're going to see that it's scrolling horizontally, and we don't want that. With the max width, if the browser width is less than this number, then it's just going to set to 100%. But if it exceeds that number, then it's going to set to that max width, which is 1234. Now we just need to center it within the screen to make it look better. So what we can do is to set margin 0 auto. Let me just close my left navigator to have more space. So Command B and then save. And now you're going to see that when I resize it, it's going to center within the screen. So that's great. Now, when you work with margins and padding, and if you don't set dash top or dash bottom, it's going to set the first number as top, the second one as right, and it's going to repeat itself, meaning that the third one is going to go back to 0, and then the fourth one, which is left, is going to be auto. This means left and right is going to be auto, which use the remaining space and therefore centers within the screen. I'm going to do the same with the padding, and I'm going to set padding 200 pixels. So this is top and bottom, and then 30 pixels left and right. Awesome. Now I have proper negative spacing, so left and right. And also my layout is adaptive, meaning that it's going to work well on mobile as well. And for bigger screen, it's going to center it within that space. So looking back at the layout, we have our wrapper, which is the entire thing. And then we have the content wrapper, which is the content area that has to be centered. And then we have another one, which we should use. And this is what I call the text wrapper. And this is where I'm going to put the text, and I will ensure that it's going to have a max width of 360. And then I'm going to put a nice animation component next to it inside my content wrapper, which is going to be a grid, so I can make it super adaptive later on. So back to my hero section component, I'm going to wrap these elements inside a text wrapper. So let's create another one, text wrapper, and put the end one right after link and save. Again, we're gonna have to declare this one as well. So const text wrapper is equal to style.div backticks. My text wrapper is going to have a max width of 360. So now I'm going to clean a little bit and replace these HTML tags with style components. So first of all, we don't need the image here, so I can delete the image, and we don't need the link for now. So I'm going to delete the link. All that remains is just the title and description. If I save it, I only have these two text. For the title, I'm going to get the CSS properties. So we only need the font weight and the font size. So let's copy those properties and go back to my code. I just need to replace the H1 by a title. So one nice shortcut in VS Code is to select, let's say, the text, double click on it, and Command D to select all the other instances. So the next one, and if you do Command D again, it's going to go to the next one recursively. So now I can change both of them at the same time. So now I have title. Then for the P, I'm going to replace it with description and for description. Let's create the style components. Const title is equal to style dot. This time we're going to use H1 backticks, and we can paste the font properties. So font weight to bold and font size to 60. We just need to create also one for description. So const description is equal to style dot p backticks. And then we're going to set the font dash size to 17 pixels. Save. So this is what we have so far. And I just want to add the line height to 130%. And this is good practice, especially for the body text, to have enough spacing between each line. For the title, we can set the color to, let's say, white. And finally, one of the things that I really like to use is something similar to auto layout in Figma, which is the gap between the elements. So if you look at Figma, we have the gaps. So this is 30, and it's really easy and flexible. You don't need to set the margin for each of the elements, which can be very cumbersome. So going back to the code, for the text wrapper, we're going to set display grid with a gap of 30 pixels. Now we have a nice spacing between the two elements without having to use margins, because if you use margin and let's say you have 3 elements or 4 elements and you go to mobile, then you have to adjust all of these margins, and it's just not very flexible. Versus here with the display grid, we only need to set the gap once. So this technique here is called CSS Grid, and we're going to cover so much more about it in later sections. But for now, this is what we have, which is a section component. It has a very nice structure. It's a little bit of time to set this up, but please keep in mind that all of this will be reused in the future. And also this structure here is going to be consistent for future section components. One last thing is that for titles, sometimes you want to set some words in different lines. So for example, we want design in the first line and code on the second line. And so to do that, you might have noticed the BR tags, and that's exactly what we're going to use here. So right after design, we're going to set BR, then save. You're going to see that design has its own line now, and it looks much better. So on a basic level, this is about style components. You can see that it's very readable. Instead of having HTML tags, you know exactly what this is about. This is about a title. This is about a description, content wrapper, text wrapper. It's very descriptive, easy to scan. And most importantly, each of these tags are components that are reusable, and we didn't need to set a CSS file for the section component. Another great feature of style components is that all of these names are isolated within only this component, which means that you can have things as short as title, wrapper, or description. It's not going to conflict with another name. In the next session, I want to show you how to set text styles, color styles, global styles, so that we can reuse them in many places of our site as part of the design system, and we won't have to repeat these CSS properties so much in terms of colors, text, and eventually be able to set theming for light and dark mode. So I'll see you in the next session.